In the aftermath of the First World War, Latvia emerged as one of several newly independent states in Eastern Europe, having secured recognition of its sovereignty in 1920 after a two-year struggle against both Bolshevik and German forces. Its political and military foundations were shaped by the need to maintain independence between two much larger powers, the Soviet Union to the east and Germany to the west. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Latvia pursued a policy of neutrality, relying on trade agreements with both blocs and maintaining a modest defense force of roughly 25,000 men in peacetime. Economic life was dominated by agriculture, with timber and dairy products forming the backbone of exports, while industry was limited mainly to processing and manufacturing for the domestic market. However, the geopolitical situation in Europe changed dramatically in 1939. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Latvia fell within the Soviet sphere under the secret protocol of the agreement. In October 1939, under intense pressure from Moscow, the Latvian government signed a mutual assistance treaty allowing the Soviet Union to station approximately 25,000 troops on Latvian soil. While officially framed as a defensive arrangement, the treaty significantly eroded Latvian sovereignty. In June 1940, following the collapse of France and the distraction of Western powers, the Soviet Union moved decisively. Accusing Latvia of violating the treaty, Soviet authorities demanded the formation of a new pro-Moscow government and the unrestricted entry of additional Red Army units. Within days, Soviet forces, numbering over 15,000 in the Baltic region, occupied all key points in Latvia. The annexation was formalized in August 1940, when the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic was incorporated into the USSR. The National Army was absorbed into the Red Army as the 24th Territorial Corps, while political purges began to dismantle pre-war institutions. The first year of Soviet rule saw profound changes in Latvian society. Private property over certain thresholds was confiscated, industries were nationalized, and collectivization policies began in agriculture. Political repression intensified, targeting former politicians, military officers, and perceived opponents of Soviet rule. In June 1941, a mass deportation operation removed more than 15,000 Latvians, men, women, and children, to remote parts of the Soviet Union, particularly Siberia. This deportation, carried out by the NKVD, created deep resentment towards Soviet authority and influenced Latvian reactions to the events that followed. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on 22nd of June 1941, Latvia was caught in the path of Army Group North. Within weeks, German forces advanced rapidly through the Baltic states. Many Latvians, recalling the deportations and repression of the previous year, initially viewed the Germans as potential liberators. However, Germany had no intention of restoring Latvian independence. Instead, Latvia was incorporated into the Reichskommissariat Ostland. The rapid change in occupying power set the stage for a complex and divided allegiance, as some Latvians sought to resist German rule, while others, motivated by anti-Soviet sentiment or the prospect of national survival, entered German military formations, including the Waffen SS. The shift from Soviet annexation to German occupation created overlapping loyalties and deep societal fractures. Former Red Army personnel, demobilized or captured in 1941, faced interrogation by the Germans. Some were sent to labor battalions, while others were offered the chance to join German-organized auxiliary police or security units. At the same time, Soviet partisans began to re-establish networks in rural areas, supported by NKVD operatives infiltrated from across the front lines. The war in Latvia would thus become not only a frontline conflict between two major powers, but also an internal struggle involving multiple armed forces, competing national visions, and a civilian population under constant pressure from both sides. This complex starting point, neutral independence lost to Soviet annexation, followed by German conquest, formed the preconditions for the emergence of Latvian units within the Waffen SS. Their creation, recruitment, and combat role would be shaped not only by military necessity, but by the unique intersection of Latvian political aspirations, German strategic aims, and the broader currents of the Eastern Front War. In the years that followed, these factors would pull Latvia further into the center of the German-Soviet struggle, binding the fate of thousands of its citizens to the outcomes of battles fought far beyond its borders. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 unfolded with remarkable speed across Latvia. Army Group North, spearheaded by the German 18th Army and supported by the 4th Panzer Group, crossed into Latvian territory within the first days of the campaign. Soviet defensive positions, held by elements of the Red Army's 8th and 27th Armies, were under strength and unprepared for the scale of the assault. The 24th Territorial Corps, composed largely of Latvian conscripts absorbed into the Red Army after the 1940 annexation, found itself caught between loyalty to Soviet command and uncertainty about the shifting political situation. Desertions increased rapidly, with some soldiers abandoning their units to return home or evade combat altogether. By early July 1941, German forces had captured Riga after only a brief urban engagement. The speed of the advance left little time for the Soviets to organize a coherent retreat. Bridges were destroyed, supply depots burned, and rail infrastructure sabotaged in an effort to slow the German advance. But these measures often came too late. The Red Army's withdrawal toward Estonia and Pskov was harried by Luftwaffe airstrikes, which targeted columns of troops and refugees along the main roads. In rural areas, Soviet authority disintegrated quickly, and local uprisings against the retreating NKVD units occurred in some districts. German occupation policy was implemented immediately after Riga's fall. Latvia was placed under the administrative control of the Reichskommissariat Ostland, with German civil officials overseeing governance and the SS managing security operations. All political parties were banned, and any expectation of restored Latvian sovereignty was quickly dispelled. While some Latvian nationalists attempted to lobby German authorities for autonomy or a symbolic national guard, these requests were consistently rejected. Instead, German planners focused on integrating Latvian resources, both human and material, into the broader war effort. One of the first measures taken was the creation of auxiliary police units, known as Schutzmannschaften. Initially recruited from former Latvian military personnel and volunteers opposed to Soviet rule, these formations were tasked with maintaining order, guarding key facilities, and conducting security sweeps against remaining Soviet partisans. By late 1941, several battalions had been formed, each numbering between 300 and 500 men. These units operated under German supervision, but retained Latvian ranks and commands at the lower levels. The German advance through Latvia also set in motion a campaign of repression against groups deemed hostile to the Reich. The Jewish population, estimated at approximately 95,000 before the war, was targeted for systematic persecution and extermination. Einsatzgruppen detachments, assisted by local collaborators, carried out mass shootings in locations such as Rumbula and Liepāja. These events, occurring within months of the German arrival, left an indelible mark on Latvian society and further complicated the moral and political landscape. While German authorities sought to harness Latvian manpower for rear area duties, they initially refrained from large-scale recruitment into frontline combat units. The Wehrmacht leadership preferred to rely on German troops for offensive operations, while using locally raised forces for security and anti-partisan warfare. However, the demands of the Eastern Front, particularly after the winter of 1941-42, began to shift this approach. German casualties and the need for fresh troops to hold vast stretches of occupied territory prompted a re-evaluation of Latvian participation in combat roles. In parallel, Soviet partisan activity inside Latvia, though initially limited, began to grow. Operating in forested regions and supported by clandestine supply drops, partisan groups disrupted rail lines, ambushed German patrols, and attempted to maintain contact with Soviet command across the front lines. The German response relied heavily on Latvian auxiliary units, creating a cycle in which Latvians fought on both sides of the conflict, some in German service, others in resistance cells loyal to the USSR. By the end of 1941, Latvia's position had been fundamentally transformed. The country was fully under German control, its political independence extinguished, and its population divided between collaboration, survival under occupation, and resistance. The stage was set for the next phase of German policy, the formal incorporation of Latvians into the Waffen-SS, a move that would both deepen the country's involvement in the war and entrench its role in the German-Soviet struggle on the Eastern Front. The decision to integrate Latvians into the Waffen-SS was driven by the evolving military situation in 1942. The German advance on the Eastern Front had stalled, and the fighting around Leningrad, Demyansk, and the central sectors of the front consumed enormous manpower. To sustain offensive and defensive operations, the Reich sought additional forces from occupied territories. While Nazi racial ideology had initially excluded the Baltic peoples from formal SS recruitment, practical necessity began to override such restrictions. In January 1943, following the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, the Reichskommissariat Ostland received authorization to raise national SS divisions in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. The first Latvian formation to be officially incorporated was the 2nd Latvian SS Infantry Brigade, created from existing Latvian police battalions that had already been serving under German command. These battalions, numbering approximately 12,000 men, had been deployed in rear security operations, including anti-partisan warfare in Belarus and guarding prisoner-of-war camps. The reorganization into an SS brigade represented a shift from auxiliary service to recognized combat status within the Waffen-SS hierarchy. Training was conducted under German officers, but Latvian NCOs and junior officers retained leadership roles at the company and platoon levels. Recruitment for the new Latvian Waffen-SS units was presented as voluntary, but in practice, multiple methods were used to meet manpower targets. German authorities organized public rallies, distributed propaganda portraying the SS as a bulwark against Bolshevism, and appealed to Latvian nationalism by framing service as a defense of the homeland against Soviet return. At the same time, administrative pressure was applied. Men of certain age groups were summoned for labor service that could be converted into military enlistment, and police units were directly transferred into the SS structure. By mid-1943, the Latvian Legion, as it came to be called, consisted of 2 divisions, the 15th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Latvian, and the 19th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, 2nd Latvian, together numbering around 87,000 men over the course of the war. German strategic goals for the Latvian divisions were clear. They were to be used as frontline infantry in sectors where German manpower was overstretched, particularly in the northern portion of the Eastern Front. The Legion soldiers were equipped primarily with standard German infantry weapons, including the Karabiner 98K rifle, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, and occasional allocation of mortars and anti-tank weapons. Heavy artillery and armor support came from attached German units, as the Latvian formations lacked their own armored components. From the Latvian perspective, motivations for joining varied widely. For some, it was a continuation of the fight against the Soviet Union, shaped by the memory of the 1940-41 occupation and the deportations. Others saw it as a chance to receive better rations and pay than those available in civilian life under German occupation. A number were conscripts who had little choice but to serve once their names appeared on recruitment lists. There were also individuals who hoped that demonstrating military value to Germany might one day translate into political concessions for Latvia, though such expectations were consistently ignored by German leadership. The formation of the Latvian Legion was accompanied by intensified German efforts to control the political narrative. Press outlets under occupation published stories highlighting Latvian bravery on the front, while official ceremonies displayed Legion banners alongside German flags. The use of national symbols, such as the Latvian flag in certain regimental insignia, was permitted in limited contexts to foster morale and the appearance of national pride within a German-controlled framework. In military planning, the 15th and 19th Divisions were intended to operate in close coordination with German Corps-level commands. Their deployment was prioritized for defensive operations in strategically significant areas, particularly around Leningrad and later in the Pskov region. Training emphasized both German small unit tactics and adaptation to the harsh environmental conditions of the Eastern Front. However, shortages of experienced officers, especially in senior positions, limited the operational autonomy of Latvian formations. The creation of the Latvian Legion also provoked strong reactions from the Soviet side. Soviet propaganda denounced the Legion as a collaborationist force composed of traitors and criminals, grouping it with other Waffen-SS units implicated in atrocities. At the same time, Soviet partisans in Latvia intensified efforts to disrupt recruitment and supply lines, targeting villages that were seen as supportive of German military efforts. This added another layer of violence to the already fragmented wartime society, as families could find themselves divided between those serving under the German flag and those aiding Soviet underground networks. By the end of 1943, the Latvian Legion was firmly established as part of the Waffen-SS Order of Battle. Its units were preparing for a year in which the strategic balance on the Eastern Front was shifting decisively toward the Soviet Union. The coming months would see Latvian divisions drawn into some of the most intense defensive battles of the war, facing a resurgent Red Army determined to push westward toward the Baltic and beyond. The opening months of 1944 placed the Latvian Waffen-SS divisions directly in the path of the Soviet winter offensive. In January, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive broke the siege of Leningrad after nearly 900 days, forcing German Army Group North into a rapid withdrawal to avoid encirclement. Both the 15th and 19th Waffen Grenadier divisions of the SS, alongside other German and Baltic units, were redeployed to cover retreating formations and hold key defensive positions in the Pskov, Ostrov, Idritsa sector. These areas were considered gateways into Latvia, and their loss would open the path to the Daugava River line. The 19th Division, composed primarily of Latvian veterans from earlier police battalions, took part in defensive fighting along the Velikaya River in February 1944. Using a series of fortified lines, minefields, and prepared artillery positions, they slowed the Soviet Second Baltic Front, which was advancing with multiple rifle divisions supported by armor and close air support. Despite this, the numerical disparity was stark. Soviet forces in the sector often enjoyed 2-to-1 infantry superiority and substantially greater artillery firepower. The defensive battles inflicted heavy casualties on the Latvian units, but they bought time for German engineers to reinforce positions deeper inside Latvia. Meanwhile, the 15th Division was still undergoing training and reorganization in Western Europe during early 1944. Initially intended for deployment in France, the worsening situation in the Baltic forced the Germans to transfer it back east in the spring. By the time it reached Latvia, the Red Army had already made significant gains in the northern sector, and the division was committed directly into defensive operations, without the benefit of full acclimatization to local conditions. The Daugava River became the central defensive line for Army Group North during the spring and early summer. The Latvian divisions were positioned along stretches of this line, tasked with preventing Soviet crossings and maintaining control of bridgeheads. The 19th Division, defending near Daugavpils, faced repeated Soviet attempts to establish pontoon crossings under artillery cover. The combination of strong defensive positions, coordinated counterattacks, and effective use of machine gun fire allowed the Latvians to repel several assaults, but each engagement depleted manpower and strained supply lines. Ammunition shortages became common, particularly in heavy weapons, as German logistics struggled to keep pace with Soviet pressure. The German command recognized the value of Latvian troops in these operations. Their familiarity with the terrain, ability to operate effectively in forested and marshy regions, and high cohesion within units made them well suited for defensive warfare in the Baltic environment. However, these strengths could not offset the overall deterioration of the Eastern Front. By July 1944, the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, had destroyed Army Group Center in Belarus and threatened to envelop Army Group North from the south. In August 1944, Soviet forces launched the Baltic Offensive, aiming to clear German troops from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. the 15th and 19th Divisions were drawn into continuous fighting as the front contracted toward Riga. The Soviets employed massive artillery barrages and armored thrusts to break through prepared lines. The Latvian units, often fighting in battalion-sized combat groups, executed delaying actions, holding a position for days or weeks, before withdrawing to new defensive points. This approach preserved some combat effectiveness, but steadily reduced the territory under German control. Civilians in the combat zones faced displacement on a large scale. Many Latvian families fled westward ahead of the Red Army, fearing reprisals for perceived collaboration with the Germans. Others remained in place, either unable to leave or unwilling to abandon homes and farms. The retreat of German forces was often accompanied by scorched earth tactics, including the destruction of bridges, warehouses, and rail infrastructure to deny them to the enemy. This deepened the humanitarian impact of the fighting, leaving large areas without food supplies or functioning transport. By October 1944, Soviet forces had captured Riga. The retreating elements of Army Group North, including the bulk of the Latvian Legion, withdrew into the Courland Peninsula in western Latvia. There, the Germans established a defensive pocket that would hold out until the final days of the war in Europe. For the Latvian divisions, Courland became both a refuge and a trap. It allowed them to avoid immediate destruction, but left them cut off from the main German forces in East Prussia and Poland. In Courland, the Latvian units prepared for a series of Soviet offensives aimed at eliminating the pocket. The terrain, forests, rivers, and coastal marshes favored defensive operations, but the isolation of the forces meant that resupply relied almost entirely on sea transport across the Baltic. As winter approached, both sides dug in for prolonged fighting, setting the stage for one of the war's longest and most stubborn encirclement battles. The next months would test the endurance of the Latvian Legion to its limits, as Soviet forces committed repeated assaults to destroy the pocket once and for all. The first Soviet attempt to eliminate the Courland Pocket began in late October 1944, only days after the capture of Riga. The Red Army's 1st and 2nd Baltic fronts massed approximately 30 rifle divisions, supported by tank brigades and substantial artillery, against the German positions held by Army Group North, now redesignated Army Group Courland. Within these lines were the Latvian 19th Waffen Grenadier Division and elements of the 15th Division, reinforced by German infantry and artillery units. The initial Soviet assaults targeted the northern sector of the pocket near Saldus, aiming to cut the defenders in two and reach the Baltic coast. The Latvian units, deployed in forested terrain, used well-prepared trench systems and natural obstacles to absorb the Soviet attacks. Small unit tactics, including counterattacks at company and platoon level, were employed to regain lost positions. Despite heavy shelling and repeated assaults, the front stabilized after 2 weeks of intense fighting. Casualties were high. Some Latvian battalions were reduced to fewer than 200 combat-effective men, forcing the consolidation of depleted companies. German command credited the local troops with preventing a breakthrough, but the cost in manpower could not be replaced. A second major Soviet offensive against Courland followed in November 1944, this time directed toward the port of Liepāja, the pocket's principal link to Germany by sea. The 19th Division was again heavily engaged, manning positions in swampy ground that made mechanized movement difficult, but did not reduce the impact of artillery bombardment. The Soviets advanced in massed infantry waves, often preceded by rocket artillery barrages from Katyusha launchers. Latvian and German defenders countered with interlocking fields of machine gun fire and the concentrated use of mortars. The attacks failed to achieve a decisive breach, but the strain on ammunition reserves and medical supplies was evident. The onset of winter in December 1944 brought a brief lull, but both sides used the time to prepare for renewed combat. The German High Command, now under severe pressure across all fronts, considered evacuating the pocket to reinforce East Prussia. Adolf Hitler rejected these proposals, insisting that Courland serve as a holding front to tie down Soviet forces. For the Latvian Legion, this meant months of static defense in worsening conditions, with limited rest and dwindling resources. The Third Soviet Offensive in January 1945 coincided with the massive Soviet push into East Prussia and Poland, around 3,000 Soviet troops in the Courland sector launched coordinated assaults against the pocket's eastern perimeter near Skrunda and south toward Dobele. The 19th Division's regiments rotated between forward defensive positions and reserve lines, but the constant pressure allowed little time for reorganization. Soviet forces succeeded in pushing the front several kilometers in places, but the defenders established new lines anchored on river crossings and fortified villages. Conditions for civilians trapped in Courland deteriorated further during the winter. Food shortages became acute, and many rural communities relied on barter or assistance from local military units. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, treating both military and civilian casualties from artillery fire and air raids. German naval convoys evacuated some non-combatants to ports in East Prussia, but space was limited, and the risk of Soviet submarine attacks made each voyage hazardous. The 4th and 5th Soviet offensives, launched in February and March 1945, repeated the pattern of massed artillery preparation, followed by infantry and tank assaults. By this stage, the 15th Latvian Division had been transferred in part to the Courland front, adding manpower, but also bringing units that had already suffered attrition in previous battles. German and Latvian forces used mobile reserves to plug breaches, often counterattacking immediately after Soviet penetrations to restore the line. Losses on both sides mounted, with Soviet casualty reports indicating thousands killed and wounded in each offensive, while German records showed the gradual erosion of experienced frontline troops. By April 1945, the strategic situation made the defense of Courland increasingly irrelevant to the outcome of the war. Soviet forces were advancing into Berlin, and German armies elsewhere were collapsing. Nevertheless, a 6th and final Soviet offensive was launched against Courland late in the month. The attacks achieved local gains, but again failed to destroy the pocket before Germany's surrender on 8 May 1945. For the Latvian Legion, the end came with the unconditional capitulation of German forces in Courland to the Red Army. Many soldiers attempted to avoid capture by blending into the civilian population or escaping by sea, but most were taken prisoner. The Soviet authorities regarded them as collaborators, and thousands were deported to labor camps in Siberia. Others faced trial and imprisonment within Latvia itself. The end of fighting in Courland did not mean the end of hardship for these men, as the post-war Soviet security apparatus sought to dismantle any remnants of the wartime formations and suppress their memory in the public sphere. The Courland campaign thus marked the final chapter of organized Latvian combat under the German flag. It encapsulated the paradox of Latvian service in the Waffen, SS, a fight framed by its participants as a defense against Soviet domination, yet one conducted entirely within the framework of German strategic priorities, ending in isolation and surrender far from the centers where the war's fate was decided. The surrender of the Courland Pocket on 8 May 1945 brought an immediate and abrupt transition from military service to captivity for the Latvian Waffen SS divisions. Approximately 13,000 German and Allied troops were taken prisoner in Courland, including an estimated 3,000 Latvians from the 15th and 19th Divisions. Soviet forces moved quickly to disarm and process the captives, separating officers from enlisted men and conducting initial interrogations to identify those accused of participation in war crimes or anti-partisan actions. The Soviet approach to Latvian Legion veterans was shaped by the official position that all members were traitors to the Soviet Union, as Latvia was considered part of the USSR since the 1940 annexation. Within days of the capitulation, large prisoner columns were marched to temporary holding camps in Latvia and Lithuania. From there, many were transported by rail to the interior of the Soviet Union. Destinations included forced labor camps in Siberia, the Urals, and Kazakhstan. The conditions during transport were harsh: overcrowded rail cars, minimal food, and limited water. Mortality during transit was not systematically recorded, but survivor accounts describe illness, exhaustion, and occasional deaths en route. Inside the camps, Latvian POWs were assigned to a variety of labor tasks: logging in remote forests, mining coal and ore, constructing industrial facilities, and working on infrastructure projects. Sentences were often indefinite, with release dependent on political decisions rather than fixed legal terms. Some prisoners were held for 5 to 10 years before being allowed to return to Latvia, while others remained in exile into the mid-1950s. The Soviet security services maintained extensive files on former Legion members, monitoring them after release to prevent any resurgence of anti-Soviet activity. Those who remained in Latvia at the time of the surrender faced a different but equally challenging fate. Soviet military tribunals and NKVD special commissions investigated suspected collaborators. While some were released after brief detention, others were sentenced to imprisonment or internal exile. The definition of collaboration was broad, encompassing not only combat service in the Waffen SS, but also employment in German administration, police units, or support services. Families of convicted individuals could also face repercussions, such as loss of property or restrictions on employment and education. The re-establishment of Soviet authority in Latvia brought sweeping political, social, and economic changes. The Communist Party, restored as the sole political power, initiated another wave of collectivization in agriculture, targeting the remaining independent farms. Former soldiers of the Latvian Legion were generally barred from positions of influence, including teaching, public administration, and skilled technical roles. Many concealed their wartime service to avoid discrimination. Despite these restrictions, some former legionnaires were able to reintegrate quietly into post-war life, working in industries or on collective farms. Others remained under periodic surveillance, with the KGB conducting interviews and searches if suspicion arose. In certain rural areas, ex-combatants became involved in the Forest Brothers resistance movement, which waged a guerrilla campaign against Soviet rule from the late 1940s into the early 1950s. While not all resistance fighters were former Waffen-SS personnel, their military training and combat experience made them valuable to partisan units. The Soviet state tightly controlled public memory of the war in Latvia. Official narratives emphasized the heroism of Red Army soldiers and Soviet partisans, portraying all those who had fought under German command as fascist collaborators. Discussion of the Latvian Legion was banned in public forums, and veterans were excluded from official commemorations. This narrative left little room for the complex realities of wartime choice, coercion, and survival that had shaped Latvian participation in the Waffen-SS. Internationally, the status of the Latvian Legion became a point of contention during the early Cold War. The Nuremberg trials declared the Waffen-SS a criminal organization, but Western governments, particularly in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, drew distinctions between SS units involved in atrocities and conscripted national legions from the Baltic states. In 1950, a U.S. Displaced Persons Commission ruling determined that service in the Latvian Legion did not constitute voluntary membership in a criminal organization for immigration purposes, provided there was no evidence of individual participation in war crimes. This allowed thousands of Latvian veterans who had escaped Soviet capture to emigrate and settle in the West. In exile communities, especially in Sweden, Germany, and North America, former Legion members formed veterans associations. These groups sought to preserve the memory of their service as a fight against Soviet occupation, rather than an endorsement of Nazi ideology. They published memoirs, organized commemorative events, and lobbied foreign governments to recognize the unique circumstances of Latvian wartime service. These narratives, however, stood in direct opposition to Soviet historiography, ensuring that the wartime role of the Latvian Legion remained a politically sensitive and deeply polarized subject throughout the post-war decades. By the late 1940s, the war's direct military phase was over for the surviving Latvian Legionnaires, but its political and personal consequences continued to shape their lives under Soviet rule and in exile. The contested memory of their service would persist, reflecting the broader struggle over Latvia's wartime history and its place within the competing narratives of East and West. The post-war resistance movement in Latvia, often referred to as the Forest Brothers, emerged as a direct response to the reimposition of Soviet control in 1944-45. Among its members were a number of former Latvian Waffen-SS soldiers, though the movement also included individuals with no formal connection to German service. former Red Army soldiers, civilians who had evaded deportation, and those targeted by Soviet authorities for political or economic reasons. Their primary objectives were to resist collectivization, disrupt Soviet administration, and maintain the hope of restoring Latvian independence. Armed resistance was most active between 1945 and 1949. Forest Brother units varied in size from small cells of 3 to 5 men to larger groups numbering several dozen. The tactics employed were adapted to Latvia's heavily forested and swampy terrain, establishing hidden bunkers, conducting night raids on Soviet militia posts, sabotaging transportation lines, and targeting informants or local communist officials. Weapons came from wartime stockpiles: German Karabiner 98K rifles, MP-40 submachine guns, Soviet PPSH-41s, and ammunition was either scavenged from abandoned battlefields or acquired through raids on depots. The Soviet state responded with a multi-pronged counterinsurgency campaign. NKVD and later MGB troops conducted large-scale clearing operations, sometimes involving thousands of personnel in coordinated sweeps of rural districts. These operations combined military force with intelligence work, relying on informant networks, infiltration of partisan groups, and the use of amnesties to encourage surrender. While some partisans accepted these offers, especially as the prospect of Western intervention in the Baltic diminished, many fought to the death rather than risk execution or deportation. The most decisive blow to the resistance came in March 1949, when the Soviet authorities carried out Operation Pryboy, Coastal Surf, a mass deportation across the Baltic republics. In Latvia, approximately 43,000 people, labeled as kulaks, nationalist sympathizers, or relatives of partisans, were forcibly removed to Siberia. This not only deprived the resistance of logistical support in rural areas, but also sent a clear signal of Moscow's determination to crush all opposition. By the early 1950s, organized armed resistance had largely ceased, although isolated individuals and small groups continued to operate for several more years. For former Waffen-SS soldiers who had joined the Forest Brothers, capture often led to harsher penalties. Soviet records indicate that many were sentenced under Article 58 of the RSFSR Penal Code for counter-revolutionary activity, resulting in long terms in labor camps or execution. Those who survived imprisonment typically faced restrictions on residence and employment after release, as well as continued surveillance by state security organs. In the Latvian diaspora, veterans associations sought to document the Forest Brothers' struggle, portraying it as a continuation of Latvia's fight for independence that began with the interwar republic. Publications in exile often linked the wartime service of the Latvian Legion to the post-war resistance, framing both as anti-Soviet efforts rather than collaboration with Nazi Germany. These narratives found sympathetic audiences in the West during the Cold War, where they aligned with broader anti-communist sentiment. However, in Soviet-controlled Latvia, any discussion of the Forest Brothers was strictly prohibited, and official propaganda depicted them exclusively as bandits and fascist agents. Within Latvia itself, the return of Legion veterans from Soviet labor camps during the mid to late 1950s created a cautious reintegration process. Many kept a low profile, avoiding political engagement and limiting discussions of their wartime service to trusted family and friends. The memory of the Legion was preserved quietly in personal circles, through hidden photographs, passed-down uniforms, and private commemorations, while public discourse remained dominated by the Soviet narrative. Economic life for former soldiers varied. Some found work in industry, construction, or agriculture, while others faced persistent discrimination. Access to higher education was limited, especially for those with known service in the Legion or links to the resistance. In rural communities, however, practical skills and labor needs sometimes outweighed political concerns, allowing veterans to contribute to local economies despite official restrictions. By the 1960s, the wartime generation of Latvian Legionnaires and Forest Brothers was aging, but their experiences continued to shape the political consciousness of their families. In exile communities abroad, the story of the Legion and the resistance became intertwined with the broader campaign for Baltic independence. Annual commemorations, particularly on 16th of March, later known in exile as the Day of the Latvian Legion, were held to honor those who had fought on the Eastern Front and in the forests. These events served as both memorials and political demonstrations, reinforcing the idea that Latvia's wartime service under German command was a forced alliance in pursuit of a national cause, not an endorsement of Nazi objectives. The reality, however, remained more complex. The wartime service of Latvians under the Waffen-SS banner had been shaped by a combination of coercion, survival strategies, and anti-Soviet conviction, all within the constraints of German occupation policy. The post-war resistance reflected similar tensions, fighting against Soviet rule but increasingly isolated, outnumbered, and without meaningful external support. As the Cold War deepened, these intertwined legacies continued to be contested in both historical research and political rhetoric, setting the stage for debates that would re-emerge forcefully when Latvia regained independence in 1991. By the 1970s, the active political and military legacy of the Latvian Legion had receded into memory, yet it persisted as a quiet undercurrent within both Latvia and the global Latvian diaspora. In Soviet Latvia, official policy remained consistent. All public references to the Legion were framed through the lens of fascist collaboration. School curricula, museums, and state media presented the Waffen-SS as an instrument of Nazi aggression, and Latvian units were depicted as willing participants in German war aims. Archival material was inaccessible to independent researchers, and veterans could not legally organize or publish accounts contradicting the official line. Despite these restrictions, personal recollections survived in private networks. Families kept wartime photographs, letters, and documents hidden from authorities, passing them discreetly between trusted relatives. Oral history served as a primary means of preserving alternative interpretations, often emphasizing the anti-Soviet motivation behind Legion service and avoiding open discussion of controversial aspects, such as participation in security operations in occupied territories. These narratives coexisted with the official Soviet portrayal, but remained confined to the private sphere, where the risks of disclosure were carefully weighed. Outside the USSR, Latvian exile communities, particularly in Sweden, West Germany, Canada, the United States, and Australia, maintained an active public memory of the Legion. Veterans organizations such as the Daugavas Vanagi, Hawks of the Daugava, published newsletters, sponsored memorial services, and provided assistance to former comrades. In exile publications, the Legion was consistently framed as a national army, fighting to defend Latvia from renewed Soviet occupation. Its association with the Waffen-SS described as a matter of German-imposed administrative structure, rather than ideological alignment. This view gained some recognition in Western political circles, especially during the Cold War, when highlighting anti-Soviet struggles supported broader strategic narratives. In the international legal context, the status of Latvian Legion veterans remained complex. The blanket criminalization of the Waffen-SS by the Nuremberg Tribunal did not distinguish between volunteer and conscript formations, or between frontline combat units and those involved in war crimes. However, subsequent rulings by Western immigration authorities acknowledged that many Baltic soldiers had been conscripted, and that mere membership in the Legion was not, in itself, proof of participation in atrocities. This legal distinction allowed thousands of veterans to settle abroad, although Soviet diplomatic missions often protested these decisions, accusing host countries of harboring war criminals. Within Latvia, the KGB maintained watch lists of former Legion members, monitoring their activities, correspondence with relatives abroad, and any signs of nationalist sentiment. Veterans who had returned from exile or camp internment faced restrictions on foreign travel, as well as routine questioning about their wartime service. While some adapted by avoiding political topics altogether, others maintained covert contact with émigré organizations, smuggling letters, publications, and occasionally symbolic items such as Legion badges back into the country. The broader historical debate surrounding the Legion remains sharply divided. Western historians, constrained by limited access to Soviet archives, relied heavily on memoirs and testimonies from émigrés, which tended to emphasize the defensive nature of Legion service. Soviet historiography, in contrast, depicted the Legion as an integral component of Nazi military operations, highlighting instances where Latvian units were deployed in anti-partisan sweeps that included reprisals against civilians. The absence of archival transparency made reconciling these interpretations difficult, and each side accused the other of selective evidence use. By the late 1980s, the shifting political climate of the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika began to open space for public discussion of previously taboo topics, including the history of the Latvian Legion. Informal discussion groups, cultural associations, and emerging nationalist movements started to re-examine the wartime period. Articles in newly liberalized newspapers cautiously broached the subject, presenting veterans' perspectives alongside, though still constrained by, official commentary. For many Latvians, this was the first opportunity in decades to see the Legion discussed in a public forum without exclusively condemning rhetoric. This period also saw the first public commemorations within Latvia itself, often organized under the guise of broader cultural or historical events. While still monitored by authorities, these gatherings hinted at a changing relationship between the state and wartime memory. In the diaspora, such developments were closely followed, and veteran organizations increased their outreach to the emerging independence movements in the Baltic states. The late Soviet era thus marked a transitional phase in the Legion's legacy. The entrenched division between Soviet condemnation and émigré rehabilitation began to erode as new evidence and perspectives emerged. Yet the underlying tensions remained unresolved, setting the stage for a post-independence debate that would be fought not on the battlefield, but in the realms of politics, academia, and public commemoration. This debate would test Latvia's ability to reconcile its wartime past with its aspirations for sovereignty and integration into the democratic West. With Latvia's move toward independence in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the question of the Latvian Legion shifted from a censored historical topic to an open and contentious public issue. The collapse of Soviet control over public discourse allowed veterans, historians, and political activists to speak openly about the Legion for the first time in decades. Organizations that had operated in exile, such as WWII, re-established branches inside Latvia, bringing with them publications, archival material, and a tradition of annual commemorations. For many veterans, this period represented both an opportunity to have their voices heard and a challenge to navigate the political sensitivities surrounding their wartime service. The political environment of the early independence movement created space for narratives that framed the Legion primarily as a force resisting Soviet reoccupation, rather than as an extension of Nazi Germany's military apparatus. Public meetings, interviews, and memoir publications emphasized that the majority of Legion soldiers had been conscripts, and that their motivation was tied to national survival in the face of Soviet rule. This perspective resonated with segments of the Latvian public, especially those with family members who had served in the Legion or experienced Soviet deportations. At the same time, the reopening of wartime history provoked strong criticism from Russia and from Jewish organizations, both within Latvia and abroad. Critics argued that the Legion, regardless of the circumstances of its formation, had been part of the Waffen-SS, an organization declared criminal at Nuremberg. They highlighted cases where Latvian units had been deployed in anti-partisan operations in territories such as Belarus, where civilian casualties were documented. This clash of interpretations quickly moved beyond academic debate, becoming a matter of diplomatic tension and domestic political polarization. One focal point of this controversy was the public commemoration of 16th of March. In exile, the date had been observed as Latvian Legion Day, marking the 1944 engagement near the Velikaya River, when elements of the 15th and 19th Divisions fought side by side against the Red Army. In the early 1990s, veterans organizations began holding commemorations at the Freedom Monument in Riga, drawing both supporters and protesters. Supporters viewed the event as a tribute to those who fought against Soviet occupation, Opponents condemned it as an attempt to legitimize Nazi collaboration. The Latvian government initially treated these gatherings as private commemorations, but soon faced pressure to clarify its position. Parliamentary debates revealed the difficulty of reconciling competing historical narratives. Some lawmakers advocated for official recognition of Legion veterans as defenders of Latvia, while others warned that such recognition could harm relations with key international partners and damage Latvia's reputation abroad. The issue also intersected with broader questions of citizenship and identity, as many Russian-speaking residents, descendants of Soviet-era migrants, viewed the Legion with hostility. In the realm of historical research, independence opened unprecedented access to archives. Latvian historians could examine military records, personal files, and German administrative documents previously held under Soviet classification. This led to more nuanced studies of the Legion's formation, operations, and the complex spectrum of motivations among its members. While some findings supported the view that most legionnaires were conscripted and focused on frontline combat against Soviet forces, other research confirmed their participation in German-led operations beyond Latvia's borders. These studies often underscored that the Legion's role could not be reduced to a single, uniform narrative. Veterans themselves played an active role in shaping public understanding. Many gave interviews to local and foreign media, recounting their experiences from enlistment to the Courland Pocket. They emphasized the absence of political autonomy under German command and the hope, ultimately unrealized, that military service might lead to restored independence. At the same time, some veterans acknowledged the moral dilemmas of serving under the Waffen-SS banner and the impossibility of separating their military role from the broader framework of Nazi occupation. By the mid-1990s, the commemoration of the Legion had become one of the most visible and divisive aspects of Latvia's post-independence historical landscape. Each March, the Freedom Monument in Riga became a site of both remembrance and protest, with veterans and supporters laying flowers while critics organized counter-demonstrations. International media coverage amplified the controversy, often framing it within broader debates about the rehabilitation of wartime collaboration in Eastern Europe. This dynamic reflected a deeper challenge facing Latvia: how to honor those who fought against one occupation without appearing to excuse their service under another. The tension between national memory and international perception would continue into the 21st century, as Latvia sought to integrate into Western institutions such as NATO and the European Union, while maintaining its own interpretation of its wartime history. The final resolution of this question remained elusive, shaped by the ongoing interplay of scholarship, politics, and generational memory. In the decades following Latvia's accession to NATO and the European Union in 2004, the legacy of the Latvian Legion remained one of the most debated aspects of the country's modern historical identity. The veterans who had once been young conscripts were now in their 80s and 90s, their numbers diminishing each year. For some Latvians, these men symbolized resistance to Soviet occupation. For others, their service under the Waffen-SS banner was an inescapable association with Nazi Germany. The state's approach evolved into a carefully balanced policy, acknowledging the historical complexity while avoiding formal glorification that could provoke diplomatic conflict. Officially, the Latvian government maintained that the Legion was not involved in Holocaust crimes and that most of its members were conscripts fighting solely against the Soviet Union. This position drew on historical research, including studies by the Latvian Commission of Historians, which examined archival records from both German and Soviet sources. However, the government also recognized that the Legion's existence within the Waffen-SS framework meant that its history could not be separated from the broader policies and actions of Nazi Germany. As a result, while veterans were allowed to commemorate their service, state institutions avoided direct participation in Legion Day events. International reactions to the continued observance of 16th of March reflected the broader geopolitical divide. Western allies often approached the issue cautiously, recognizing Latvia's right to interpret its own history while urging sensitivity to concerns about honoring units affiliated with the SS. Russia, on the other hand, used the commemorations as part of a sustained narrative portraying Latvia as rehabilitating fascism. This narrative was amplified in Russian media and diplomacy, particularly in contexts where Latvia criticized Soviet-era repression or opposed contemporary Russian policy. Within Latvia, the debate over the Legion's memory became a recurring feature of political discourse. Nationalist parties tended to support public recognition of Legion veterans, framing them as freedom fighters whose service was part of a longer struggle for independence. Left-leaning and minority parties, along with human rights groups, argued that public commemoration risked normalizing a morally compromised past. The Freedom Monument in Riga continued to be the focal point of these debates each March, with veterans, their families, nationalist groups, and foreign dignitaries sometimes appearing alongside protesters, journalists, and police maintaining order. Academic research in the 21st century further complicated the picture. Greater access to archives in Germany, Russia, and Latvia enabled historians to construct more detailed accounts of the Legion's recruitment, combat operations, and post-war fate. Studies confirmed that while the Legion primarily engaged in frontline battles against Soviet forces, some of its constituent units, especially those formed from earlier auxiliary police battalions, had participated in German security operations in Belarus and elsewhere, where civilian casualties occurred. This evidence reinforced the view that the Legion's history was intertwined with both legitimate military resistance and the darker realities of occupation warfare. For many younger Latvians, the Legion was less a personal memory than a historical controversy inherited from earlier generations. Public opinion surveys indicated a divide along generational and ethnic lines. Ethnic Latvian respondents were more likely to view the Legion positively or neutrally, while Russian-speaking respondents often adopted the Soviet-era interpretation. Educational curricula addressed the topic within the broader framework of World War II and occupation history, presenting multiple perspectives and encouraging critical evaluation of sources. In the diaspora, especially in North America and Western Europe, veterans associations gradually shifted their focus from active political advocacy to historical preservation. They funded research projects, supported museum exhibits, and contributed to oral history archives. As the number of living veterans dwindled, these organizations concentrated on ensuring that their version of the Legion's history would remain accessible to future generations. The eventual passing of the last Legion veterans marked the end of a direct living link to the events of 1943–45, but the political and symbolic weight of the Legion in Latvia did not disappear. The question of how to integrate this chapter of history into the national narrative remained part of the country's ongoing dialogue about identity, sovereignty, and historical justice. The Legion story embodied the dilemmas faced by small nations caught between competing totalitarian powers, where choices were constrained, allegiances were often imposed, and the line between survival and collaboration was blurred. In the end, the history of the Latvian Legion serves as both a subject of academic inquiry and a touchstone in public memory. It reflects the broader struggle to reconcile wartime realities with post-war values, to honor sacrifice without ignoring context, and to acknowledge the complexity of a past shaped by forces far beyond Latvia's control. As long as Latvia continues to confront its history openly, examining it through scholarship, public debate, and commemoration, the legacy of the Legion will remain a vital, if contested, part of understanding the nation's journey through the upheavals of the 20th century.